All right.
Yada yada yada. Uh,
John Kemp is one of my favorite energy analysts. He used to be a Reuters columnist. Then a year or two ago, he left and he set up as an independent. And I get his daily energy newsletter, which is a must read for anybody in the energy industry. And then on top of that, he writes columns. And usually I agree with the arguments in his columns. Not today. 10th of September, the column is titled Asia Will Dominate Energy Consumption Through 2050. The title is innocuous, but some of the assumptions behind his argument I take issue with. I disagree with him, and I'm going to explain it to you. So let's start with a quote from John. Asia is expected to account for essentially all the increase in global oil consumption through the mid 2030s and all the increase in gas consumption through 2050, end quote. So essentially, Asia is where the action is, folks. And that's the strategic implications for Canada is that Asia remains essentially the center of gravity for global energy markets through 2050. That's where all the growth is coming from. The West, think of it as the global North, because we'll throw in Japan and South Korea as well. The global North is going to decline. Even OPEC agrees that oil and gas demand will decline. And it'll be the global South, particularly Asia, that expands. So John says that the exporters of oil and gas and coal, but particularly oil and gas, must prioritize Asian demand centers. Well, there is a very good reason why. That explains the behavior of Alberta Premier Daniel Smith, of the Canadian oil CEOs. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been talking up oil exports, gas exports, and pipelines, and also his natural resource minister Tim Hodgson, who's a fellow Goldman Sachs executive and a real bulldog and a deal maker. I mean, they honestly believe that there's going to be a big market expansion in Asia, and why shouldn't Canada export more of its oil and gas off the West Coast to take advantage? So John also makes the point that renewables deployment is amazingly, I mean, it's happening at a scale that we can't even imagine, but not even close to displace fossil fuels. We'll get into that in just a moment. Now, I want to argue that there are, in fact, two models, two ways of looking at this. And the first one is the Western energy future model. And to understand that, you have to look at the post 1945 primary energy demand growth. So here's this graph that you see, and what John has said is Asia's energy transition has been characterized by additions, not substitutions. New sources have supplemented rather than displaced older ones, end quote. So you hear this all the time in Calgary. And Alex Pourbet, the CEO of Cenovus, used to say diversification, not displacement. And he was essentially saying the same thing as John. And that is like a mantra in Calgary. Everybody believes that we're just going to be adding to in the future, not substituting, not displacing. And so, why is Asia likely to be growing? And by the way, the OPEC, everybody agrees. So, the global north is going to decline. What's going to drive the global south is population rising, income surging. A lot of these countries are emerging economies. They're emerging middle class, and they want the same stuff as the global North's middle class. They want cars, they want houses, they want stuff, and we're going to have, and they'll be their energy consumption will grow accordingly. And urbanization. That's another very, very powerful trend going on. You see it in China. You see it in many of the Asian economies, in fact. All of that together will drive the same kind of growth in the future that the global north drove in the past from 1945 up to essentially 2000, and then China took over and drove growth out to just recently. Now it's peaked, and from 2025 on, over the next 25, maybe 50 years, John and others are expecting that Asia will grow primary energy demand. And so all of the renewables, any other form of energy that we come up with, will just add to service that growth. So it's a big, big assumption. And then here's another one, and this amuses me to no end. The Canadian LNG bulls use a climate lens. Now, these companies very seldom talk about climate, but what they do is they point to the amount of coal that's being used in Asia, and they say, you know what? We could supply LNG to China, to India, to Indonesia, so on, and they could use our gas instead of coal and bring down their greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. It just simple as that. The problem is that's not the way Asia sees it. And this is how I'm going to explain how China sees it is more or less how many other Asian countries see this. So for China, yes, they are expanding their power sector. And the reason why is not because they want to, build out wind and solar with some additional hydro and nuclear to lower their emissions. They want to do it because they have also at the same time electrified demand. And you've heard me say it before in other videos. The real revolution in this energy transition is not on the supply side, the supply of electricity, the supply of new energy. It's on the demand side. We have now electrified devices that we couldn't electrify in the past. We didn't have the technology to bring down the cost and make them competitive. Well, now you can electrify transportation and not just cars and trucks. You can electrify two-wheelers and three-wheelers, which are huge in Asia. You can electrify school buses and transit buses and delivery vans and excavators and on and on. Essentially, just about every kind of work vehicle you can imagine. China can electrify it. And so they need, because they're electrifying their demand side, they need electricity to feed that. And so but here's the thing. Using more electricity, electric devices are generally about 3 times as efficient as fossil fuel devices. Take an EV. It's about 75 or 80%. That means, the energy you put in is you get work out 75, 80%, whereas fossil fuels are, like 20, 25%. The internal combustion engine, it'd be between 20 and 30%. And so you need less energy. You need more electricity, but you need less energy. And so as China electrifies its demand side, that changes everything because you don't need as much oil and gas. And then on top of that, China has an explicit policy to use electricity to displace its oil imports and its LNG imports. So it imports about $325 billion worth of oil a year and 40, $50 billion worth of gas. Those are enormous bills. And that they have to take their foreign cash reserves to pay for those imports, where they'd be much better off if they electrified their entire transportation sector and didn't use any more gas and just supplied their own gas with their own production. Now they don't have to send that money over to, Canada or the United States or Australia or wherever it's going. They keep it in the economy. It's better, a lot better for them. So there is the policy, the explicit policy that China has is being copied by other Asian countries. Malaysia would be one. Absolutely explicit in policy. We're going to electrify and we're going to displace that. So when you think of the benefits that come from electrifying your demand side, so you got to build out your power sector and you use a lot of coal, and you get to displace all of those expensive oil and gas imports, coal suddenly looks like a pretty good bargain. Even if you're not lowering your emissions, that's the way to do it. And that's the way China thinks about it. And that's the way essentially Asia's. And if most Asian countries follow this route, and China, of course, is the 800-pound gorilla. So if it leads, and even some Asian countries follow, then that's going to significantly affect the future of demand for oil and gas within those countries. So it makes perfect sense. And so we have the Western model where the future looks pretty much like the past. And we have the China model where you electrify demand and then you have to grow your power sector to supply it. And coal just becomes a big part of that. And I should mention, China has a very explicit policy about how it's going to grow its power sector. It's going to build out wind and solar in mass. I mean, huge amounts. I may not have my numbers correct, but I think it was like 600 gigawatts last year. It was just an amazing amount. And then some hydro and some additional nuclear. And they're continuing it this year. The first 6 months. It was bigger than the first 6 months of last year. So that's going to continue. And coal now is down to like 51%, but they're not doing it to eliminate climate emissions. And here's the thing, they plan to keep their high efficiency coal plants as backup. And they brought in a capacity market already, which basically pays backup power generators to, like coal plants to be on standby. So when you're needed, crank that thing up, and you get paid for it. And when it's not working, you get paid for it anyway. So you're paid there as backup. That's the plan. That's why they keep building these plants and retiring the old inefficient ones. We have a very different view of coal than we do here in the West, and for obvious strategic reasons. So let's talk now about the current energy mix because fossil fuels are like 83% of all the energy that Asia consumes. Coal is 46%. 80% of all global coal generation is in Asia. Gas is 25, or sorry, oil is 25%, gas is 12%. And John makes the point that gas remains underutilized compared to North America and Europe. Yes, because they don't have much of it. I mean, China is. I think it's China's fifth or sixth biggest gas producer in the world, but most don't, and so they don't want to, for economic reasons and strategic reasons. They don't want more gas. They don't want to displace coal out of their power sector. So, and then renewables and nuclear, even though renewables have expanded tremendously over the last 3 or 4 years, still a small share. So there's lots of room for growth there. So where does that get us to 2050, according to John? Well, oil demand is going to decline in China and Japan, and it'll decline in the global north, in the United States and Canada and some of the other countries. But it's going to rise in India and the rest of Asia and South Asia. Gas is going to continue to grow everywhere except Japan, and electricity there'll be sharp growth everywhere, driven by cooling, EVs, and digitalization. But the curve will look over the next 25 to 50 years will look very much like it did. The primary energy demand curve will look very much like it did after 1945. So we're just adding more and more demand, and then we have to create the energy to meet that demand. Um, that is very much a Western view on it. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the International Energy Agency has essentially got this correct. Now they've been getting maligned. The Americans have been beating on them. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith takes every opportunity to call them a political organization and political activists and so on. But here's the thing that they really need to actually read IEA reports because IEA has done the most of any energy agency in the world at reporting on the electrification of economies outside of North America and Europe. And they produce all kinds of reports about what's going on in Asian countries and Latin America and Africa and so on. And the IEA says that oil is going to peak in 2029. Gas will probably peak in 2030 or maybe in the early 2030s. And then there are three scenarios. The steps, which is basically a status quo, maybe a slight decline out to 2050. The APS, which shows a significant decline in both LNG and oil. and then the net zero. Net zero, is very low. Oil and gas demand is very low, but unlikely to happen. I don't think we're going to be anywhere near net zero. So it's more likely the APS case, in my opinion. The APS case essentially kills the Canadian argument for more exports of LNG and oil. There won't be enough of it. And there are plenty of other low cost competitors like Saudi Arabia and Iraq, who I keep saying, it costs them $2 to get a barrel to China, and it costs us $18. Who's going to have the advantage there because they also produce it more cheaply? So, all in all, I think this column, and I'd urge you to find it on the line online and read it. But this column nicely illustrates the myopia that the West has towards Asia. We don't understand the age of electricity yet. We're still stuck in this fossil fuel past, and we tend to we've got our goggles on, and when we look to the future, we see pretty much just a continuation of what we're accustomed to. China's rewriting energy history. It is the first electro state. So if I had to bet, I would bet that the China model, not the Western model, is the one that dominates, and that has enormous strategic implications for Canada.